Guys, welcome. So Bisco. So it's good to know that there are new people at Bisco, because it's important to maybe just give a little bit of a wrap up around what Bisco is. It's Business Co. or Bisco. We have friends who get the name wrong. They call it Business and Co. It's not like McKinsey and Company or anything like that. It's Bisco. Yeah, to be clear. We kind of started this thing a couple of years ago now, and it was really on this idea of most of us as Christ followers are in the workplace in some shape or form, and you know it's kind of not a trivial question as to how you live out your faith as a Christ follower in the workplace and in business. And so during the course of last year, we really just started this with speakers who came in and spoke with a sense of like testimony and with a particular topic that was kind of key to them. And then towards the end of last year, we got a speaker called Andy Crouch. He's a guy who's with an organization called Praxis, but he's a well-known kind of theologian and speaker, a Christian speaker in the US. And he came to us quite by accident. About this time last year, I think we had this breakfast. It came to us by accident. Actually, it's even more modest than that. He was coincidentally in Cape Town, and he's friends with one of our friends, Jonathan. And Jonathan was like, "Hey, Andy, welcome to Cape Town on holiday. By the way, you've got a speaking engagement." And so we casually moved him in, and about 400 people arrived to listen to him. We were like, okay, this is the power of the attractive speaker. But what Andy did was Andy introduced us to this concept, this framework called the Praxis Redemptive Business Framework. And I absolutely loved this framework, and I think the rest of the team did as well. And because what it did was it resonated with me, this kind of search for what does it really mean to live out your faith in a meaningful way in the workplace, and to go beyond. They talk about the sort of three frames, the three domains. There's kind of the exploitative domain, the ethical domain, and the redemptive domain. And so, just if you haven't been in, the kind of recap is the exploitative domain is best summarized by like I win, you lose. Okay, so I win, you lose is something that you see quite a lot in the world, right? It's the kind of thing we look at and we're like, that guy's a bully, this person, this person's behaving in a way which is like, I win, you lose, is I get and I take, right? And so a lot of people in the world do operate like that. Some of them are in prison. Others ought to be in prison. But there are many actually who actually are behaving perfectly legally, but they kind of still behave in that way. And we're all kind of tempted sometimes to behave in our moments of pressure. We kind of are tempted to go there, aren't we? Like it's like I win every now and again. It's like okay, even my kids play a lot of sport. My son plays sport, and I'm also tempted every now and again to be like, what domain are we operating in here? I think the exploitative domain in the rugby field sometimes feels like it's tempting, right? But then you get to the ethical domain. The ethical domain is where we would most of us feel that's actually where we ought to be, right? That's kind of what we aspire to, right? And it's even the sort of thing where around boardroom tables and businesses, we would say to each other, that's how things should be. Don't be in the exploitative domain. Try and be a better person. Pull yourself out of that. Put yourself in the sort of ethical domain. The ethical domain is like I win, you win. Okay, so that's the world of sustainability. It's the world of contracts that can be enforced fairly. It's the world of fairness, essentially. But actually, what this framework calls us to is to go beyond that. And the redemptive frame is best described like I sacrifice, we win. So I sacrifice, we win is this idea that actually we go beyond the I win, you win. We go beyond fairness, go beyond ethics, and we go actually into the redemptive realm. And that's actually, if you look at the gospel of Jesus, that's actually what he calls us to. Many thinkers, many speakers, many writers throughout history have drawn us to the ethical domain, but it was actually only Jesus of Nazareth. He changed the world by drawing us to this redemptive domain. The redemptive way of thinking is this kind of I sacrifice, we win. And of course, he was the person who made the ultimate sacrifice as God's son. So that's this kind of theology that underpins the framework. And so this year we had our three speakers who are here today. And so my job today is not to speak. The clock is not running, eh? That means I can start from 45 now, or not? Is that okay? Keep going. So what we're going to do this morning is each of our speakers covered the topics of kind of leadership, strategy, and operations. Because if you take the framework, if you look at how it gets developed, you have this idea of redemptive leadership, which is why we build, redemptive strategy, which is what we build, and redemptive operations, which is how we build. And so we had Jonathan and Rory and Kerry, who in each quarter this year covered each of those topics. And so we thought for this morning what we're going to do is have a panel discussion where we kind of get them together, and I get to ask questions and I have to answer any questions. Amazing. And we will go to allowing the audience also, for all of us here, to kind of ask some questions later on and really just have a conversation, kind of deepening our understanding of this. So I'm going to call up each of our speakers: Kerry, Rory, Jonathan. That's you. Rory's on his phone. I don't know what he's doing. He's WhatsApping his wife. Yeah. So join us. Everyone's got a mic, eh? So we're going to... Yeah, welcome. I should have done more of a, here's Rory. I should have done that, but okay, anyway. So guys, great to have you with us. It's been an amazing year of covering this framework. I just thought, and what we'll kind of do is we'll go that way, I guess, because that's kind of the order that we covered the topics in. I just thought, Jonathan, maybe just for the benefit, we know certainly they're new people, but there's also people who only perhaps came for one of the breakfasts if they were here. Just talk a little bit about redemptive leadership in the context of this framework.
Yeah, well, good morning again, everyone. Can you hear me okay? It is on. All right. How's that? It's coming through okay? Okay, great. So yeah, when I was sharing on redemptive leadership, the basic thesis that I was offering is that leadership is a stewardship of power. And most of us, either consciously or unconsciously, probably have this idea that the more to have control of a situation is to have power. And if you don't have control of a situation, you don't have power. And basically what I was arguing is that actually the role of a leader is not to hoard his power or her power, but rather to release power through others. That is actually how power is unleashed and put to work, is not through how much you can accumulate as a leader or how much you possess, but how much you can release in others. And therefore that actually takes us right to the heart of what Yuri was saying around sacrificial leadership, that it's actually a relinquishing of the power that you possess that actually unlocks the potential of that power in others, which is how leaders are actually effective. So that's the short version.
Jonathan, and maybe to then move on to Rory. Thank you for that intro. So redemptive strategy. Strategy is a broad topic. It's kind of hard to define, right? Strategy generally, and redemptive strategy in particular is kind of like what is redemptive strategy then? Just give us a sense of kind of the angle, the lens that you brought to it.
Thanks, Yuri. So I think the essence of it was that we employ strategy in instances where the probable future is not our preferred future. And so we employ strategy in order to steer things from the probable to the preferred. And strategy is the means by which we figure out how to do that in spite of contestation and constraints. And so my talk then focused on how are the outcomes that we're seeing out there in the world reflective of a redemptive strategy or not. And my argument was that it seems to me that if we are employing redemptive strategy, it's losing. It's either losing or we're not actually employing redemptive strategy, because the patterns, and that's what, if you look at the praxis frame, speaks about the redemptive domain being about renewing culture. And culture is really the habits or repeated patterns of behavior that drive repeated patterns of outcomes. And so if we are going to shift the repeated outcomes or the persistent outcomes, we have to change the repeated pattern of behaviors. If the outcomes persist that we would assume to not be redemptive, then it means that something in the way we're trying to go about changing the repeated pattern of behaviors is not winning, and that we then need to be more strategic in this pursuit, because I think what I start off with is that we're at war. It's a battle. We may have redemptive notions of how the world should be, but that doesn't mean they will automatically be assumed. We are going to have to, it's about our ideas in contest with other ideas, and the only way they win is if we then adopt a strategic approach to how it is that we shift culture and renew culture towards different behaviors that then drive different outcomes.
Always remember the saying, your business is perfectly designed to give you the results you're getting, right? So it's almost this idea of, like, if you look at what's around you, if we look at what is out there, then we can't claim to be winning.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? We've got to claim, we've got to acknowledge where we are.
Yeah.
Harry, redemptive operations, and in particular, kind of how we kind of broaden our imagination to what's possible with people and products and operations. Just tell us a little bit about how your kind of the lens that you brought to that.
So I think on the back of what Rory just said, I think we all have that same observation, that we might have really good intention or desire to see the end result being different, and intentionally even designed for that. We may have pure motivation and have real deep kingdom motivation behind a lot of what we're doing, which speaks to the leadership axis that Jonathan spoke to. But maybe we're losing because we actually just don't know how to execute. And so we can do really well in the realm of ideas and thoughts and motivations, but if it's not becoming practical, then we're still losing. And so a lot of what I spoke about was what does operations look like, or what does it look like when it becomes practical, when it actually becomes tangible. And so often when we think about business, I think a mindset around efficiency has snuck in. It's all about being efficient so that we can get best value and offering to client as efficient and cost effective as possible. But if we go back to scripture, I see a different definition where operations, or the actual execution, because operations can sort of box you to quite a narrow thought pattern. But actually, the execution of all of this intention and motivation is all about the stewardship of the people, the environment, the business, the processes that you've been given, those things, or that you're creating, but those things you are to steward. And to what end? To add value, but in a way that restores. If you look at the Bible, Jesus, he did the greatest restoration act, and it speaks to that same concept of sacrifice. Can we restore things without sacrifice? The second thing was multiplication. So God calls us to multiply. He wants to see things become fruitful. He wants to see abundance. And then the last one is bless, but from an enriching perspective. So everything we do should enrich, it should multiply, and it should primarily restore. And so how do we actively think that through? And later we'll touch on some practical ways to think it through and invest time and have the tacky hit the tar. But how do we truly steward these things in a way that will do those three aspects of restore, multiply, and bless?
So in all of what you've said, there's kind of this idea of kind of success and failure, right? We talk about like victory and defeat. Okay, this is not an easy thing. Let's focus on kind of victory for the moment and say, okay, so I sacrifice, we win, right? I sacrifice. It's not I sacrifice, we both lose. It's not I sacrifice, we win one day. It's kind of I sacrifice, we win. What are some examples that we can kind of point to that each of you can think of, like how this is actually possible? Like, because one of the things I think in this framework is for us to actually realize that it is possible. Like God is actually calling us to this. He's calling us to bring flourishing. He's actually calling us to bring these things not in a not necessarily just for future generations, but for generations right now. So, what are some of the best examples of I sacrifice, we win, actually, being lived out that you've seen, Jonathan? Maybe start with you.
Yeah, I'm grateful that um, God has given me a life where I've been able to actually see stuff happen in front of my eyes, and I'm very, very grateful for that. I remember when I was in university in the UK, and even back when I was a young man, it was very, very, very secular environment. In those days, to believe in God was a laughable thing. And that never bothered me when I would be challenged about my belief in God because of what I'd seen growing up. So as some of you know, I grew up on the island of Papua, which is the western half of the island of New Guinea in Indonesia. And the tribal community that I grew up among was extremely warlike and actually cannibalistic. And in terms of sacrifice, two of the first missionaries that went to work amongst the Yali people were killed and cannibalized in 1968. And my family, my mom, dad, and me, arrived 3 years later. So as a kid, I remember seeing warriors walking around with all their gear on, their war paint, their bones and feathers, and spears and bows and arrows. I remember that sense of threat in the way they carried themselves. If you go there today, it's not like that at all. There's been a massive transformation. There has been no violence, no war for decades. And that was all because of the impact of people being transformed in mind and then socially. Not in ways that altered their culture to become Western, but that altered who they were as people within their culture. So I've seen that, and the other thing I'll just comment on is that history has a lot of examples to show us as well, and maybe we can come back to that later on in the Q&A.
Yeah, I think, let me give maybe two examples. I think the first one is maybe a cliche for a lot of us, right? But you've got a man who's been in prison for 27 years on an island not too far from here. Comes out having lost a lot for what he believes. He comes out of that place and potentially carrying all of the reasons to be vengeful and to want to see those who have done to him experience at least a fraction of what it is that he has gone through. He takes a brave call to say, that's not the direction that we're going to go. It means I'm going to have to sacrifice my anger and all of those things. I'm going to have to sacrifice the people that I've walked the journey with, because it wasn't just my loss, it was the loss of millions of people. And I'm going to have to rise above that in order to be able to shift the pattern of behavior that is going to characterize this country moving forward. Now there's complications there, right? We know that what was also sacrificed was his family and all of those things. But I think that is just one example that we're probably all familiar with of Nelson Mandela saying, I'm going to sacrifice to try and set up an alternative future for South Africa. I think we don't recognize how the idea of having a bloodless transition is actually quite novel across the whole world, and that was by an individual who made a particular decision. So I think that's one example, and I think we're all beneficiaries of that particular decision. And I think if you go back in time, you read about Wilberforce and the end of slavery. And what I like about that particular example is that these were politicians, they're prominent people who had the conviction that slavery is wrong and that it needs to change. And their efforts were actually aimed at, they were beneficiaries of this, they cheap labor, they were benefiting, they were the ones who were actually in the seats of power that enabled them to be the prime beneficiaries of the persistence of slavery. And through being convicted, they then decide that we're putting a stop to this. And as we do that, then what we see that then follows as a pattern of behavior and outcomes for the broader society is arguably a more sustainable and a more redemptive leaning outcome. So I think there are examples where this happens, and I think we often hear of sacrifice, but that there is a collective we win. This is where you see those types of examples. So it's possible.
Great examples.
Hard to follow those examples.
You know?
Come on. Here in Zerwani, you must see some examples of this, right?
No, absolutely. And I think there's these beautiful examples that are changing whole systems, which I think we should all be excited to be a part of. But then there's also the slightly closer to home stuff, right? There's what's happening in your personal business, what's happening directly at home. And so my examples are a little bit of the, what's happening in your smaller microcosm, I suppose. And so some of my biggest learnings, most of you may know if you were at the last one, that I have been or was a part of Mergon for 14 years. And when I joined Mergon, which is a private equity company that's also a big philanthropic entity, I was really surprised by the way that Mergon went about things. How we prayed about every single transaction, every single investment. When cash flow was tight, we'd all come in, we'd fast and pray together, we'd come in early and pray every morning for cash flow to be released, cash flow pressure to be released. And so there was this crazy other world that I was suddenly experiencing when I joined Mergon. Now, I suppose it's always important to have a caveat. Everybody in Mergon's also human, so we didn't always get it right. And we definitely tripped over things, we definitely have fallen natures, and so that's also true. But one of the examples I want to give is an investment company. It was a logistics company that we're invested in, and it was time for us to now exit this transaction. It was time to exit. And so our leadership team walks a very close journey with the entrepreneurs that they invest in. And they knew that they needed a specific type of investor, not any investor. And so they actually went on a journey where multiple investors had come along and they weren't the right fit for this organization. And at the end of the day, Mergon ended up going into a deal with somebody that was a much better fit. It took a lot longer. The terms were not as good, or the outcome was not as good. But it was an I sacrifice, we win scenario, because what was happening was that business could flourish into perpetuity because this investor was going to be a majority shareholder. And so it needed to be a culture fit. And so culture fit was way more important to the executive team than actually the maximizing the return. They still got a good return, don't get me wrong, but the intent behind it was really different. And so there was definitely a posture of I sacrifice, we win. Another more recent example is a lady that I've been doing some stuff with, based in Australia, and she realized that there's no female entrepreneurs, or very few in Australia, and so she started working with female entrepreneurs. But what I loved about her thinking was everybody read that book of Sheryl Sandberg at a stage called Lean In. It was all about really showing up at the table, and it always made me a bit uncomfortable because I felt like I had to be more of a man. Be like, I'm here, like, listen to me. And when I was chatting to her a couple of weeks ago, she said, the problem with that, and there's merit in it because sometimes it is hard to be heard at a table, but the problem with that is it made it a personal problem when it was actually an ecosystem challenge. And so she's actively gone and helped educate the ecosystem around how do we help create permeable ecosystems and not closed ecosystems where certain people are being excluded from it, unintentionally often. And so I thought that was a really beautiful example of something so simple, but having a kingdom view of what the actual challenge is. So she came in with a restorative view. This is multiplied. I mean, Canva came out of the accelerator, Modi Body, which is absorbent underwear. Anyway, they've just been sold for a couple of billion.
Available at the back building.
But done really well. There's multiplication and there's massive blessing in what's come out of it. And so we can do things in our own area of influence too.
I guess, look, in God's economy, I guess it's all about people, right? And so you kind of think of in the long run, and just think of the example of marriage where you say, okay, well, so what works in marriage is that I win, you lose, that doesn't generally work terribly well for long, does it? You know, even I win, you win, and he works for a little bit. And I sacrifice, we win. That's generally, that's generally the recipe, right? And so, kind of going from that to other human relationships, I think we should not be surprised that actually I sacrifice, we win leads ultimately to flourishing. But of course, we are living in lead brokenness all around us. Right? We're living in a broken world, and so failure looms, right? Failure is there, the shadow of failure.
Yuri, if I can just maybe to your point, I think where I find this quite profound is that, in all other frames, I might be looking at saying, I need to go and redeem the world. But for me to get to a place that says, I sacrifice, we win, is actually about focusing the redemption internally. It takes, for me to let go of that which I treasure,
Yes.
is going to require me to focus internally into becoming redeemed myself of the grip I have over my power, my treasure, and all of those things. And so it's an orientation thing about, where must my redemptive focus be? Is it out on the world and fixing that, what's wrong in the world? Or is it about fixing my heart so that I can be of greater good to the world?
Yeah, that's profound, and that's exactly right. And it makes me think, Jonathan, of something you said in your talk around like the redemptive leader is the leader that empties themselves. Right? So, and maybe that's the segue to the question, right? Is I think maybe we know why we fail. We fail because we're not doing that. But how do we think about approaching that problem of the self-sacrifice, redeeming myself before I try to redeem the world?
Looking at me again? I was thinking as you were introducing this, how much of the suffering or pain that I've experienced in the course of my life and career has been as a result of me, in a constructive way, sacrificing and therefore paying a price, versus how many times have I suffered pain because I failed. And I would say it's definitely the weight is on the latter. And I want to maybe focus in on that. Because there have been times in my life where I've taken what I believed was a stand on something that was important, and I paid a price for it. But there have been many, many times in my life where basically failure has happened to me, and I've learned to recognize that it is God's gift to me, because failure is an interruption of what could have been worse if we were allowed to keep going.
I think there's a quote there that someone can write down.
And I've had moral failure in my life. I've had professional failure in my life. And I could speak to both in the sense that, without going into detail, on the moral failure was basically surfacing within me, despite all the good intentions that I had and even as a young man, the gifts and skills that I felt God had given me and a genuine sense of call. The moral failure that I engaged in, which was abusive as well to the other party, exposed in me what needed to be fixed if I was going to be in any way useful, but also it's really nice to get fixed. Failure is that gift that opens up the opportunity for you and I to be healed and to become the people the world needs us to be. And then professionally, around 10 years ago when I was 45, basically off the bus, I went through a big crash and burn. I had just come out of running a big mediation process in Southeast Asia. They've been very, very demanding. And I was the guy that people like in the room because I'm calm, I'm collected. If there's disputes, if there's conflict, I just roll with it. I'm Mr. Calm. That's what a friend once called me. And that's how I actually saw myself. If God has given me a strength, it's that ability. And after that mediation, which basically collapsed, I suddenly had health issues. I was suffering from chronic insomnia. I actually had to give a keynote at a conference. And prior to that keynote, in 4 nights, I didn't sleep at all until the last night. And the last night before I spoke, I slept for 3 hours. So in 4 nights, I had 3 hours of sleep. I thought I'm either going to die or I'm going to go insane. and this was a months-long recovery journey, but also over years because it was episodic. But it took me a while to realize that this too had been a gift to me, to expose to myself frailties and limitations that I wasn't sufficiently conscious were there in me. And again, it was hard. Wouldn't wish it on anybody. But coming out the other side, not only do I remember back to moments, for example, sitting in the middle of the night, and it's dark, and God is silent. And then you realize he's silent, but he's there. It's like this vast presence. He's there, but he's silent. He's just waiting. It's a time for waiting until the job is done. And yet I can also look back and see all that I learned and all that he taught me that I would say, has strengthened me for today. And I think we need to receive failure for the gift that it is. But it's only possible to see it that way if we know that there's a God behind it, who's above it, and can make it that gift.
So, Kerry, from your side, I think this kind of reflection on failure, it kind of goes to the heart of what this redemptive work is, right? It's actually recognizing that actually it's not about the failure out there. It's actually about what is the redemptive work that God is doing inside me as a leader and what He's called me to do. What are some of the, what does that mean to you in some of the work that you've done? I mean, you've had the privilege also of working with a lot of leaders who are trying to do exactly this. What's some of those personal journeys that you've seen?
Yeah, I'll probably go one personal and then one of somebody that actually is based in Uganda. But I think for myself, if I think back to some of the failures, and a lot of them, generally I find failures happen to be around people where you're like, could have handled that better. And if I look at this image, I often wonder how often I've aimed at redemptive and I've accidentally landed in exploitative, not even ethical. And that's often because I only have a one-dimensional view. So I'm hearing my view. And I can often justify these things through a very, very spiritual lens as to why we need to hold the hard line, or we need to, it's more loving to discipline, or, so you can justify really, really easily a lot of your actions. But sometimes I wonder, have I spent enough time to truly understand the fullness of the picture? Because the people around me that I'm busy bouncing this off are often in the leadership team with me, or are people that will have a very similar lens to me. So we all just build on one another, like, yes, they're very redemptive. That's a great, yes, we're on the right track. But the person who's experiencing it, I'm pretty certain that some of the times where I've missed it, they've experienced it as exploitative. And so that's not okay. My intention was incredibly badly executed by the looks of things. And so how do we actively go out and try to get counsel from spaces that will be able to represent other voices that we're not hearing? Because that might give us context to some of the decisions that we're making, and help us go to Scripture and look at Scripture from a deeper and broader perspective, and not just to the couple of verses that conveniently align with my view. And so I think it's a tough one, and you might even feel like you're sacrificing, to be totally honest. because it's still hard and it's tough. And so all of these checkpoints can actually be in place, but if the person still feels like it was exploitative, I failed. And so how do we do that better? And so I suppose that is some of the stuff that I'm still trying to learn through some of my failures. And then this isn't necessarily a failure, but I think it's more out of, it's situational. So there's a guy in Uganda, incredible guy, came out of the slums. And he was given the opportunity, somebody gave him a laptop, and was super driven, started designing websites and things, managed to get some training, and started finding that he could actually find work online in the frontier, or the first world market, if you want to call it that, in the West. And so instead of going and becoming a fat cat and making a lot of dollars and pounds and things, he started creating an internship where he brought in other people that came from the same background that he had come from. And slowly but surely, everybody, and what was so beautiful is because of the context he came from, and I suppose this is linking to failure, when we've learned things from contexts we've been in, his wasn't necessarily failure, his was situational. But from what he had learned, he could do things so differently. So he didn't give laptops. The laptops had to be paid off over time because people had to earn them. There was dignity in that. So he understood the economy of dignity. And so what has ended up happening is he's built this massive business of people that are coming out of the slums that are now getting contracts with him. They are being paid the same rates as anybody else in the UK or the US. There's a nice story to it too, so people really like using them as a design agency. And they've now built this massive warehouse that's an incubator and a sort of entrepreneurship hub just outside of Kampala. And probably about 400 people are economically active now and are able to plow back into the slums just outside of Kampala because one guy decided to be redemptive and not build his own empire, but actually go back and understand the context and truly push into it. And I think that's really beautiful. So how do we use our context and our failures to really just shape how God can use us and sacrifice, I suppose, some of our own ambitions for the bigger kingdom vision?
So, guys, if we sort of just staying with this theme, but moving forward and trying to make it, I suppose, as practical as we can. That's a great example. That's a great example, Kerry, of someone who's of a great success story to show that it's possible. What are some of the practical things that if we were to and we're going to go to a table discussion in a few minutes, but if each of us were to kind of take forward from here something in our minds as to how we might put the redemptive framework into action in our domain, whatever that is, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're working for a non-profit or you're working for a bigger company. What does it do that? And maybe the thought is, I suppose, what's the personal journey there? Because I think we've talked about the role of the personal in this thing, right? It starts with you. If we're not starting with our hearts, Rory, then we're not starting, right? So maybe I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Yuri. So I think it's heart, head, and hands as I think about it, and Andy Crouch speaks about culture as what we make of the world and what we make of the world, and what he means there is that what we make of the world is how do we perceive the world? What do you make of the situation in the world? And I think what we make of the world in that sense is driven by what informs our views on why the world is as it is. And I think that the first thing is that it's being very deliberate about what informs our views. And I think I might have spoken about this, how when God is about to undertake a redemptive mission of the Israelites, he starts off by, I have seen, I have heard, and I have known the suffering of my people. To what extent does that inform? And I'll give a practical example just to make it more real. A few months ago, a plane landed in Dallas, Washington. It had 49 South Africans on it. What do I make of that plane? What do I make of that situation? Yesterday, a plane landed in Johannesburg with 150 Palestinians. What do I make of that? What are the differences and what informs those differences? And I think that a big part of what would help us is, the original thing, even the separation from the Garden of Eden. The segregation is actually the first step because we are segregated from diverse views and so on. And so I think the first thing is what informs what I make of the world is who I'm surrounded by and the extent to which I'm segregated from other things. I think it's that, and then it's what we make in the world. So what are the things that we're literally doing? And I think maybe later I'll show a slide that just shows how, in spite of our good intentions, when we are presented with particular contexts, the temptation is to move away from redemptiveness because that's all we know. That's what we've been taught to do. And so I think being very mindful about what do I make of the world, and then how does that inform what I end up making in the world is probably the starting point for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. What is abundant in my heart, and how does it influence how I perceive, and how does it then influence the work of my hands, and particularly my posture towards sacrifice?
That's good. That's good. Jonathan, you spoke about, in the Q1, you spoke about a kind of, I think you called it a righteous anger, which you said it's a good snack but a bad diet. But this thing of like, what do we see in the world? What do we make of the world? And then what do we make in the world? Maybe, what role does that kind of purpose that stems from a righteous anger play?
Yeah. And the reason I said righteous anger makes a good snack but a bad diet is because anger is the correct response to seeing things that are wrong, to seeing systems that are harming people, or to see an individual harming someone should rightly lead us to a place of anger. But anger is a very unhealthy fuel to drive us as we move forward. Because the way forward is not actually to obliterate the oppressor. South Africa's future will not be healthy because the oppressor is obliterated, but because there's a right relationship between those who oppressed and those who were oppressed. And of course, we know biblically as well that every single one of us sits in both seats often of oppressing and being oppressed. To maybe go into a bit of detail, I think, so when Trace and I moved back to South Africa in January of 2023, we had been away for 17 years. Now, we'd stayed closely in touch with things here, so nothing was a big surprise to us. Nevertheless, once you're actually back on the ground, what was very, very striking to me was how, despite the fact that there are many, many good things, many good redemptive strategies, or well-intentioned redemptive strategies in play, good-hearted people doing hard work, not a lot has changed. We could blame Guptas and Zuma or whoever else, but the church is a massive presence in this country. And so the question that I had when we came back is, what has the church been doing for nearly 2 decades? There's so little has changed. And I think there is a place to say it's not acceptable that we are where we are. And if we stay within the ethical frame where, no, but I'm leading my home well, and I'm trying to do my best for my kids, and hold down a good job and be ethical at work, nothing will change. We have to move up into the outer sphere of being redemptive, and that means to start to pay a price. Now, at the level of choices, I would say 2 simple things. Is firstly, on the personal level, in your home, think about the agency that you have. The agency that you have, especially for those of us in this room, it's likely, not everybody here, it's likely you have the agency that allows you to build up equity. that you have the agency that enables you to afford good health care, what would it take for you to relinquish a bit of that agency and extend it to one other person or one other family? Just one. Now, how many are in this room? Roughly 80. There's 80 more people that suddenly get agency. Maybe not as much agency as we'd like, but more agency. And so that's at the very individual level. That's something that we can think about and do in the short term. Don't do it without consulting, to Rory's point. Don't be that benevolent, oh, I know what's best for you. To enable agency is to be respectful of the other person and their dignity and their identity. So that would be on that level, and then on the professional level, I do think we need to say, how is my business, my industry, the value chain I'm in, the sector I'm a part of, in what way is it not helping the issue of poverty or inequality? And what can my business change with regards to that? And that will probably take months of homework and years of work to even start to work on. But you might as well start. Oh, sorry, you have a mic.
Thanks, Jonathan. Kiri, kind of closing thoughts before we get to Q&A later on, how to take some of this conversation forward as an individual leaving this room.
Again, I'll bring it down to the business level. So we work with lots of business leaders across the African continent, and the biggest question that we're dealing with is, how do you practically take redemptive thinking into your business? And so we have two different things that we run. One is a couple of evenings that people are on an online course called Foundations, and it actually looks at the theology of work. But what has been amazing to me is when people choose to invest some time as an individual to really think deeply around, and we take everybody through a framework of God's original design for either your sector or your business. Dream about it. What could it be? What is the distortion that exists? And map that out, and then go, okay, well, I can't change every distortion, but what are the few distortions that I want to now tackle to try and close that gap between what I believe God designed my business to be and what it currently is? But then the next step to that, and links to what Rory and both Jonathan were saying, is that's just an individual view. And so often, we don't actually understand, we don't even have a holy anger for the things that we need to have a holy anger of, because we don't even know some of the things that exist within our business that we should be holy and angry about. And so we run a second process with executive teams, and often the next tier of leadership too, where it's a design thinking process that you take the whole business through, looking at, and sometimes it's overtly Christian and sometimes not, what is God's original design for your business? What is the brokenness? And what's really interesting is seeing how the design changes. So when you do it by yourself in your own little cupboard, it's beautiful. But when you have a bunch of people doing it, there's just this richness of like, wow, God has so many different facets to this original design. It's actually even more beautiful than I imagined. And then when you map out the brokenness, there's brokenness that you discover that you never even thought was brokenness. And some of that is actually more important to handle immediately. And there's easy action steps, sometimes not so easy, but there's things that you can put in place. And what's beautiful is you've gone through it as a team, so you can then together decide to tackle a couple of things to actively pursue being redemptive. And then you have accountability built into that you really are busy doing that. So I think it's a very practical way. I think my biggest call out would be invest in it. Invest time in thinking through being redemptive. Invest time with your team to try and understand the layers of brokenness that exist, so you even know where to have a holy anger, so that you can actually intentionally go and try and be redemptive in spaces that maybe nobody else, well, you're not seeing, but everybody else is seeing.
Amazing.
Can I quickly just add to that? If you want information that will help you develop or cultivate the radar for holy anger, just read your Bible.
Don't read it right now. We're about to go to Q&A, but yes, later on. Guys, thank you. Great conversation. Loved it. Great to have you. Thank you for the engagement at the tables. So we are going to go into a time of Q&A. if you need to leave at 9, we do typically commit that people can leave at 9. If you want to leave at 9, there is a walk of shame, which is that you walk past around the back. Actually, there's no need for shame. I mean, this economy needs people working. We can't all sit eating a bran muffin at like 9 o'clock in the morning. You know what I'm saying? We need productivity. No. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and then at 9, I'm just going to give an opportunity if people do need to leave, and then we will carry on until about 9, probably 9:20, 9:25. So start off with a question. We're cheating now because my friend Carl asked a great question at our table. Not to put pressure on you, Carl. If you don't have a great question, think of one quickly. But Carl, let's start with you.
So one of the things that came to mind as I looked at redemptive leadership and redemption is that one tends to think, and I think there's lots of people in this room that are leaders or might be in charge of a company or entrepreneurs, but I think the question also is how can one be redemptive when you aren't setting the tone and you aren't the leader who's creating this atmosphere, but you're in a company and you're a mid-level worker or a backbencher somewhere. How do you do that?
Can I jump in?
Well, the word backbencher is particular to Carl's. If you're not familiar, it's when you're a member of parliament coming in, then you start down there, hey Carl? Backbencher. Kerry.
So I'll just give an example that happened recently just in my team. And so we're not massive. So hopefully there's not too much upward management needed. But we were part of a very collaborative undertaking, maybe. And we found that we had less authority to make decisions than we thought we were going to have. And so it ended up creating this constant conversation in my team where we were just frustrated and we'd often speak in a very frustrated way about this whole undertaking. And one of my team, we have prayer meetings on a Monday, so we are very overtly Christian, so that is different to your context. But in our Monday prayer meeting, she brought scripture all about becoming self-righteous and our heart postures and like how are we doing in this. And it totally convicted the entire team, myself included, around just how we were showing up. And it was about 2 weeks out from when we needed to implement on this thing. And it was beautiful to watch. There were still lots of frustrations in the actual execution, and there was still brokenness within the system. But it was beautiful to watch how myself and my team, more my team than me, because I wasn't as much in the detail, how their heart postures had totally shifted. And they were there with such servant hearts, just rolling with the punches. No ask was too big. And if a person in my team who isn't in my leadership team hadn't brought that, we would have arrived with a very different posture. And so that was a beautiful way of upward redemptive management.
Rory, I loved your comment around like don't start with what's out there, but start with what's in here.
Yeah.
Feels relevant as well.
Yeah, no, I think, maybe two things quickly. Obviously, well, not obviously, but humans are designed to seek out and find that which works and keeps them safe and keeps them in comfort. And so we explore, and then we find something that works, and then we lock in. Sacrifice is always an invitation to let go of that which keeps you safe, or that which produces predictable outcomes. And so, I think in many ways, there's this constant challenging of what keeps me safe, what gives me predictable outcomes, and constantly just working on that. I do think that we all have a domain of influence, and we are part of a broader ecosystem. And what we understand about ecosystems is that there's a symbiotic relationship, and there's relationships in relationships. And if you change the way you behave, it doesn't just change you, it changes the way that everything around you behaves in relation to you. And so I think it's useful to think that, yes, while we are trying to change big systems, it always starts with me and the way I behave. And if I can change the way I behave, and so just speaking practically about, what do I leave here and do? I think we can all probably leave here with 3 things that we could look at and say, I could change this, and it can't be just general things. Sacrifice implies something I value. What is it that I could sacrifice that I value that could potentially change the broader outcomes for everybody else? I think that's it.
So we are at 9 a.m., so we're going to just give an opportunity if anyone does want to slip away quietly, do so now. Yes, Jonathan.
Just want to quickly announce before anybody leaves what next year
Yes.
is bringing us. So this year, as you know, we worked through leadership, strategy, and operations within the Redemptive business frame. Next year, we'll stay with the framework, but we're going to do deep dives into a number of topics and take a different approach. So we will be looking at technology and tools, probably specifically at AI. And again, what does it mean to think about these things redemptively? And the role that tools should play, and whether or not they're mastering us, or whether they're being used for the purposes of flourishing. We will talk about, so after technology, we'll talk about people, and specifically mental health and personal well-being in the workplace and in the life of a leader. Thirdly, we'll be talking about profit, but profit in the context of our country. Inequality, wealth distribution, what is a redemptive approach to being a profitable business? And then finally, value creation, rethinking the products and services that we have and how impactful they are. And so the theme for all of this is to have a redemptive imagination showing up in these 4 areas of technology, people, profit, and value creation. And then finally, just to let you know that we have confirmed that Andy Crouch is coming back next year, not for holiday. And we anticipate that he'll be speaking in a public event on May the 6th, probably end of day, like an evening event. So just pencil that in, but we'll update you with more concrete details in time. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. If you have to leave, go with God's grace.
So I'm just going to as we give people a second to slip out quietly, just a reminder, if you haven't seen it on the screen, you can scan a QR code that'll give you a number that you can WhatsApp your questions to. That is the number of Mark McKinley. You should save that in your phone. Message him day or night. Any problems you've got, just do that. So Mark is okay. So I want to. Okay, there's a great question here that's come on the group, but I want to just ask. The segue from what was said earlier around the role of, like Rory, you said, we hold on to that which keeps us safe. What is the role of fear in our lives as a barrier to being redemptive?
So I think, maybe it's first important to understand that fear is part of the makeup of how we were created. It is meant to keep us safe very often. And I think it's as we then, advance, and I liked what was said at the table, is that, fear can very quickly become a reflex in our lives that then drives our behaviors. And it's about creating those gaps between stimulus and reaction that often allows us to choose alternative behaviors. But when we are in high fear states of mind, we don't then have the opportunity, because that evolved from needing to run away from danger. And so I think being very good about understanding what informs my fears, being very good about understanding what it is that is legitimate fear and what is it that is fear that I've come to believe is true but is not, is actually quite important in then driving the types of behaviors that follow. I think it is useful to remain safe, but when that which keeps you safe constrains you from a bigger and broader impact on the world, then I think it's where we need to ask ourselves. And I think in a country like ours, with so much happening, there's so much opportunity to be fearful. And it's then a calling upon us to actually be the ones that go beyond that which is familiar. Because often what we fear is that which is not familiar.
I thought just something to add on the back of that. I loved what you said, Rory. I heard somebody coin this term the other day where they said reckless faith-based risk. And so I found it so refreshing because this lady was talking about we're always going to, if we want to be redemptive, we are going to be stepping into the unknown. There's always going to be risk. But sometimes we'll be on the one side of the spectrum where we'll just take crazy risk without even thinking about the ripple effects of what might happen. And then on the other side, we don't take any risk because we're trying to be too safe. And actually, so she does risk management in Tunisia. Ex-FBI agent, super interesting. And she was speaking about how important it is just to take stock, take a moment, take stock, like understand the risk and then pray about it. If God is calling you to take that risk, then do it because you're stepping into it in faith. But don't just recklessly go into things where you could actually end up putting multiple other lives at risk because of your own conviction. And if you end up doing that, then do it very prayerfully and possibly consulting some of the people that you're going to pull into the risk with you. And so I think that was just a wise thing, that there is fear is a thing, and it can keep you safe, but it can also stop you from stepping into redemptive purpose and almost try to help yourself figure out where you are on that spectrum. And taking crazy risks isn't unredemptive, and being safe isn't unredemptive. It's actually just trying to figure out from God what you're being called to step into.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to take a question that's come through, but I also want to say there is a roaming mic as well, so you guys can also ask your question yourselves. So there's a kind of a great question from corporate life. How do you have a redemptive heart or mindset when your managers or seniors obviously don't have this? The words obviously no, they weren't in bold, but you can sense it. Yeah. I don't know what you think.
Oh, I have to answer this one? No, actually, I was thinking of this, Carl, when you were asking your question earlier as well. And I was thinking back to when I was a young man, and fortunately, by kindness, I was allowed to participate in senior management meetings. And being the age I was, and as smart as I was, I had very, very good analysis of how mistaken so many of our decisions were, and how wrong-headed so many of my colleagues were, in senior management. And some of that might have been accurate, but some of it was just, youthful arrogance. But I remember a guy who was kind of a mentor to me, picking up on the fact that I didn't have the best relationship with some of these guys on the senior management team. And he encouraged me to do something which has really stayed with me. He said, part of the problem is that because of what you see, you have a default disrespect. And that will show up in your relationships. And so he challenged me with an exercise where I went to each one over a coffee or a lunch and basically asked each one, is there anything I can do to make your life easier? Is there anything I can do to support you in your work? These were not my line managers, these were colleagues. And it was a very humbling exercise because many of them were great, but there were a few of them I actually did not respect because of what I saw. And that created a deep shift in my relationship with every single one of those people. That made it a lot healthier. So I think when you do see dysfunctional stuff happening above you, these are still people made in God's image. They are still people that God knows stuff about that you don't, good and bad. And if anything, there's something that will emerge that is actually, I would say that kind of constructive behavior towards such people actually causes good stuff to surface in them. And so that might feel like small change in the beginning, but it actually creates the relationships needed for larger change down the road.
And I guess there's this point around the world isn't divided between people who are redemptive and not redemptive. We're all actually suffering with brokenness, right? And so it's all about the lens you're looking through at a given point in time. Are there any? I've got a question here. Just checking if anyone wants to have a question. Lisa Carrier, you look like you got a question. No, you're just looking. No. Anyone? There's a roaming mic. Okay. This is a good one. It's like when, not that the others were not good, guys, but this is good. When it says, when thinking of the redemptive journey and wanting to action the process in my business, what am I actually getting myself into? So this is obviously a business owner as opposed to someone who earns a salary. What are your comments on the timing of the win? So I think that's so if we talk about I sacrifice, we win. What does win mean, and over what time frame? Like, is it now? Is it in 20 years? Or is it kind of like, and I think this is like only being rewarded in the eternal kingdom of heaven, which I think is the kind of like concern, right? Is like, okay, what is the win and what is the timing of the win? What do we mean by win? You've stumped the panel.
I'll stab at it first. I think it depends on what you decide to tackle. So when you figure out what are the things that aren't redemptive in the way that you're running your business, because we're all going to have them, no matter who we are, and no matter how hard we're working at it, we're still living in a fallen world, so they're going to be there. So you're going to map it out and go, these are the ones I want to tackle. And you're going to probably choose some early wins, quick wins. There's some easy things that you can do that will make everybody's life a little bit easier. And is it I sacrifice, we win to your team, or in the way that you design your products, or the way that you're structuring your pricing, or whatever it is that you think that you want to be more redemptive in. But then there are longer wins that are going to have much bigger long-term impacts. And those are probably going to be societal or environmental. So those will be long-term shifts that you'll be a part of creating. But then there is the longest-term impact, which is kingdom, which is heaven, which is souls in heaven. And we actually can't force that. But the deep desire, I suppose, in being redemptive in the way that we act is that people are seeing something different. So I was having, somebody came over to my house last night and we were chatting. And it's a company based here in Cape Town, led by a Christian guy. The team is from all different faiths. And they have somebody that has gone on this beautiful journey where they've actually going from being very gender fluid and being very against the church because of the example and some of the redemptive practices that are happening within the organization. This person started getting curious, started attending churches, and has now found a church and is on this beautiful journey with the Lord. And so there is a long-term win that probably the business wasn't the only input, but God used it as one of the inputs. And so I think your wins it's a spectrum with short-term to long-term, and you get to choose what God's giving you grace for and vision for.
Yeah, so thanks, Kerry. I think when we formulate strategy, we often say that the role of leadership is to shape and to shift long-term trends. And so when you formulate any strategy, you've got a long-term trajectory of outcomes that you're trying to establish. But as you would all know, year by year, quarter by quarter, there are milestones to that. So the wins of today shape the wins of tomorrow. And so I don't actually think it's about, do I win now or do I win in the future? Am I maintaining a trajectory of winning that ultimately gets me to where I want to get to? So there are wins in every single day that will serve as the stepping stones towards the wins of the long term. And the way that I see it is that you can probably see the trajectory towards the long term win in a very linear fashion. But the day-to-day wins are actually cyclical. It's cycles of winning. It's action, impact, and results that are happening every single day that cumulatively then build the linear path towards winning. So I think as we then define winning, it is about saying, what do I need to win at today in order to create a stepping stone towards ultimately winning? And so there's an opportunity in each day for a win towards the ultimate win.
just want to touch on this as well and shift it more into a systems change framework. So if you think of the size of a system and how long it takes a system of that size to go through transformation, that's also helpful. So you talked about the abolition of the slave trade earlier, and I don't know if the men became what was called the Platinum sect, who were the initial drivers of the movement against the abolition of the slave trade in the UK, realized that it was going to be a 14-year project. When Mandela and other colleagues in ANC or other organizations were meeting back in the 50s and 60s, did they know how long it would take? I remember when I first arrived in South Africa in the 90s, about 4 years after your elections, and my colleagues were saying to me, we all believed that apartheid would eventually fail. It had to fail because it's unjust. But none of us saw it happen in our lifetime. And so are we prepared for that long haul? But it requires intentionality. It does require that this is the project I'm committed to, day in and day out, at that kind of granular level that Rory's talking about. And so it's everything. It's the personal journey, it's the changes that we go through, it's the relationships that we're in, and the building blocks that each of those is creating, and so on and so on and so forth. But I also think it's important to keep in mind that this eternal perspective. The abolition of the slave trade took 40 years. It took another 10 years to abolish slavery itself within the UK. And we still tell the story and we still remember it. But today there are multiple more millions of men and women being traded as slaves around the world. So does that mean that was a disaster actually? No. But it does mean that on this side of eternity, sin will keep showing up. The work doesn't stop. And it isn't until the Lord returns that all this good that has been done by his people over the years comes into its fullness. So we need to keep that perspective too.
Oh, that's good. And I guess when we talk about sacrifice, the point is you've got to have a long-term view of sacrifice. It's a sacrificial life, actually, as opposed to a sacrifice to win, kind of a payback. I was talking about prison when I went to prison. I've been able to get to know a couple of people who were actors who went to prison. And they're a different group of people to the people that we have in leadership mostly today, right? Because they all went to prison as young people, basically not expecting any of the change to happen the way it happened. They had to prepare themselves for a lifetime in prison. And so that's a different kind of character. It's different. I don't want to. There are examples, of course, we all know. We're subsequently disappointed, but I think that's the kind of posture you've got to have in the sacrificial life, is a long-term view. But I wanted to also add this, and going back to the question about the business owner. Like there is risk, and there's also wisdom required in these moments. So how do I overlay wisdom, what it looks like to be sacrificial in my business, and that's also redemptive.
So I think in Luke 6, as I was just meditating on today, Luke 6 was quite prominent in our hearts. And Luke 6, verse 32 speaks about, but if you love those who love you, what credit is it to you? If you lend to those from whom you expect to receive back, of what credit is it to you? And it just says, but love your enemies, do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High. And so I think to your point, it's not, redemption is an outcome, redemptiveness is a lifestyle. And it's really about how we behave day to day, and we leave the results to God, but making sure that the posture of our own hearts is constantly towards redemptiveness.
I'm taking control, Yuri.
So, Yuri, I'm actually going to turn the tables on you now. So, I know your exposure to leadership in business is a bit limited, but I thought I'd still like to put you on the spotlight. So I think most people know here that Yuri earlier this year was made group CEO of World Mutual, and so that's a large corporate system. And you've been on a journey, or you began your journey as CEO, fresh out of a sabbatical period. I'm not fresh in my bed. Fresh out of a sabbatical period in which you have been contemplating what it means to be redemptive. And so what has the journey been, and what are the things that you feel you have been able to do, and what are you wrestling with? What do you mean as being a redemptive CEO in a large corporation?
Does anyone here that worked for Mutual have any experience whatsoever by leadership structure back here? There's always one Mutual person at least. You're going to it, thank you. Please do. Someone's going. I mean, look, I would say two parts to it. One is, it is a great privilege to be able to lead a large organization in the sense that you do have the platform to be redemptive. You don't have you're not sitting, okay, my senior manager is obviously not redemptive, what do I do? You're sitting in the situation, okay, well, how do I steward this responsibility? And I think it's, although, believe me, as a CEO, you've got bosses too, right? You've got boards, you've got shareholders. So it's not as though you can feeling fully in control of your life either. But I do think there's, on the one hand, an opportunity to speak truth and to kind of lead in a redemptive way, and you have a privilege to do that almost unchecked within bounds, so I think that there's that opportunity to do that. Okay, but there is also it comes with pressure, and this is where I think Rory was saying earlier. He wakes up every morning feeling redemptive, and kind of in the sacrificial frame, and then he gets kind of sucked back into the exploitative during the course of the day. I think we all feel a bit like that. So when there's pressure on us, and it happens with all of us, there's always pressure. But if you're talking about being CEO of a large company, you've got pressure all the time. You've got people. Yesterday, a guy wrote a nice article about me that I've got a palatial office. Did you read that, Trevor? I didn't even build the office. Here he's got a palatial office with a Briar area. That's how he started his article. It's like, dude, I didn't build this thing. Come on. And I'm not giving it up, but it's made now. Yeah, did you have to write about it? Really? Yeah, exactly. My board members actually posted, they were like, when are we coming for a Briar? We don't have this Briar. And then there's another guy who put out a note yesterday of saying, I think his headline was from elocution to execution, which was basically like, okay, we've heard your speeches, now let's do it. That's pressure, and I would say we probably have some unique pressures that we want to. There's some aspects of our business we want to turn around. What's been most challenging for me is my reaction to that pressure has been, and it's not always redemptive. It's not always sometimes I have the space to do that, but sometimes I just translate that pressure onto everybody else and just push it down. And that's not necessarily always, you have to translate the pressure, right? You have to convert pressure into, okay, guys, this is what this means for all of us. But it's not always, it can also become exploitative. It can also, you get tempted to kind of really pull the levers of okay, this is your deadline, but this is what you need to do. This is super hard. I'm not interested in how you're going to do it. You need to figure out how you do it. You come back and tell me when it's done. Okay. So for me, from a leadership journey perspective, it's just trying to kind of calibrate that balance around how do you how do you cope with pressure? How do you cope with your own reactions? The work. I think it's common to all of us, right? It's just how do you do that in the redemptive way?
Thanks, Yuri. You shared something at the table about, it sounds simple on the level, but it actually has the potential to shift your culture well. And not a secular way of talking about speaking truth in Gallagher.
Yeah, well, this is this is an example of, I guess, we've got this thing in a culture piece that we're doing where I talk all about candor and kindness. That's this idea of, speaking truth in love, but in a kind of a secular context to talk about candor and the ability for people to have hard conversations and face difficulties, but do it in a way which is kind. to people that is not, those two things can coexist. And then I get people who are Christ followers like Trevor, who like, okay, dude, I know what you're saying, actually. Truth is love, right? I know, so, so this is sort of a code for the Christ followers, the organization. But even secular people can be like, okay, I can think of that as a constructive way. So that's probably, I would say, in the former category of things that I feel, okay, tick, good job done. But I'm not always using candor with kindness in my own life in day to day.
Thank you for sharing that. I got sent a question, so I'll keep explaining. I'm going to direct this at you, Gary. So get ready. Now the question is, should we want to go through the I presume it means the praxis framework or the redemptive framework with our leadership team to look through our operations, our original design, and to map out the brokenness? Is there a guide or a practical framework we can follow, especially for a team who is not following the Lord?
Yeah, so I would encourage you to take a team through the process. I think it's very, very fruitful. We've actually seen the process be very fruitful. And just what Yuri did with Candor with Kindness, you can really speak about biblical truths without having to say redemptive and distortions and sin and brokenness. You can talk about brokenness, that's very, so you can neutralize the language really easily. So you maybe slightly adjust on the praxis framework. What we use is we actually use the DDR, Design, Distortion, Redemption, to run the process of thinking through what you need to pay attention to from a redemptive perspective. And then you can use the praxis as a lens to see if you've actually fallen into the ethical or redemptive category. So ask yourselves, the actions that we've decided as a team to do, are these win-win? Are these sacrifice-win? Are these win-lose? And so that's a really helpful as a lens to put on to go, how well have we done?
You're right, too.
I hate talking about it. So we have a course called Foundations, and you're welcome to sign up. And we have lots of leaders coming through it, where you can just spend time yourself going through it, or you can get a copy of your team on it too. And then we actually come in and we run workshops with your team to help manage the process over a day or a day and a half.
If I can just a quick one. I don't know if we can pull just from the back, if we can just pull the slides. I think it's also useful to bear in mind that redemptiveness then is not a template. It's not like, okay, if I do this, I'm being redemptive. If I don't do that, I'm not being redemptive. Is that there are instances where pressure or direct conveyance of the pressure is the most redemptive thing, but there's cases where it's not. And so as I was thinking about this, can you just move just move on, next slide. And next slide is that, so if we look at that, I guess that's where we are. We aspire to be at all times. But context often changes how we then show up. And so if you move on to the next slide, and if you're looking at crisis, is that when we're dealing with crisis, very often we're pulled into, using people. It's me at stake. It's whether we fail or we lose, it's on me. I start thinking about people, and I don't have time to be thinking about renewing culture in a crisis. We need to just leverage what we have, and we need to keep it moving. And so I think it's useful for us to think, and then I tried to do a similar one for when you're in a growth season. You found what works and you just want to ride it. You also don't want to be renewing culture there. We found what works, let's ride the wave. And so I think an analysis of how we behave in different contexts is perhaps useful to just bear in mind that it's not about a single behavior at all times, but it is about an appropriate behavior at the right time. And so that for me was just useful to think about, when I'm in crisis, where do I go to? And how do I create just that gap between my action and reaction that gives me an opportunity, a fighting chance, as was said, to at least choose a redemptive reaction.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Wayne. Thank you. And that is, guys, a great note to, I think, wrap up our conversation. So there was a really important question posed, like, will there be coffee afterwards? I think that was from Rachel, which I'm sure it was. So the answer is yes, apparently there'll be coffee. I don't know who's making it, but it's probably a McKinney. It's making the coffee. Yes, there he is. So guys, thank you. Thank you for being with us and for sticking with us till 9:30. We trust that you've enjoyed. I've loved this conversation. And so, big thank you to everyone who has been behind the scenes organising McKinley's and non-McKinley's. The guys at the desk at the back, Claude, all of that action. That's just wonderful. Thank you for all the hard work. Thank you to the Bisco team behind the scenes of putting it together, and then most of all, thank you to our panelists, to Kerry, Wilkie, Jonathan.